Imagine a city the size of Chicago running on empty. Not a metaphor. Actual gas stations with actual lines stretching around actual blocks. Drivers sitting in their cars, engines off to save fuel, waiting for a pump that may or may not have anything left by the time they reach it. Now imagine that city is not in a war zone. It is in Russia, far from the front. And the governors are going on television to tell people the problem is panic, that everyone should just calm down, that there is plenty of fuel. And yet, at that exact moment, the Energy Ministry is quietly forming a crisis task force in writing, acknowledging that drone strikes are the reason the fuel is disappearing. Two messages, one country. And somewhere in the gap between those two messages is the real story of this war. So here's the question I want you to sit with before we go any further. What happens to an army when the country feeding it starts rationing gasoline to its own civilians? That question is not rhetorical. It is the operational heart of what Ukraine has been building toward for months, and what the last 6 days have brought to a kind of inflection point that even cautious analysts are struggling to understate. This is not a story about one drone strike or one refinery fire or one nervous governor blaming panic buying. This is a story about the deliberate, systematic dismantling of Russia's ability to turn crude oil into the fuel that moves its war machine. And this week, something happened that had never happened before in this war. All 3 refineries inside Rosneft's integrated Samara refining hub went offline simultaneously. For the first time, at the same time, 3 plants, 1 region, 0 crude processing. Today is June 14th, 2026. In the last 72 hours, the tempo of this campaign has tightened in ways that will take weeks to fully understand. Ukraine struck the TANECO and Taif-NK refineries in Tatarstan over 1,100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. It struck the Afipsky refinery in Krasnodar. And on June 12th, Ukraine's general staff confirmed in plain language that the Kuibyshev refinery in Samara, hit in the pre-dawn hours of June 9th, has fully stopped operating. The processing units are down. The storage is burning. And the region that once fed those 3 interconnected plants is now a black hole in Russia's fuel supply map. This is the war underneath the war. And it is accelerating. This is Proffer Jang. If you follow the money, the fuel, and the logistics of this conflict, rather than just the headlines, this channel exists for you. Hit subscribe if you want to understand what is actually happening, because I promise you the real story is almost always more consequential than the one being told. Let's follow the money, or in this case, let's follow the diesel. The Samara hub is worth understanding on its own terms because it is not 3 random refineries scattered across a map. Kuibyshev, Syzran, and Novokuibishevs are Rosneft's integrated regional cluster. They share logistics networks. They share supply chains. They were designed to function as a system, which means that when you take all 3 offline simultaneously, you do not simply lose the output of 3 facilities. You eliminate regional redundancy entirely. There is no internal backup. There is no plant B that absorbs the load while plant A recovers. The whole system goes dark at once. And what was that system producing? Kuibyshev alone, just one of the 3, processed 4.7 million tons of crude in 2024. That translated into 1.4 million tons of diesel, 0.8 million tons of petrol, and 1.3 million tons of fuel oil in a single year. Diesel is the number that matters most here. Diesel moves armored vehicles. Diesel moves logistics trucks. Diesel pumps fuel through the rail networks that feed forward operating bases. The Russian military does not run on gasoline. It runs on diesel. And Kuibyshev's 2 primary crude distillation units, CDU4 and CDU5, each processing around 10,000 metric tons of crude per day, are both now offline. Both confirmed by Ukraine's general staff on June 12th. The plant has stopped operating. Those are not Ukrainian words. That is the military confirmation after their own strike team reported back. But Kuibyshev did not fall in isolation. Syzran, the 2nd plant in the hub, has been fully offline since May 21st, when Ukrainian drones disabled its own primary distillation unit, CDU6. That is now over 3 weeks of 0 output from Syzran. Novokuibishevsk, the 3rd plant, halted operations on April 18th and has been running at reduced throughput ever since. So when Kuibyshev went down on June 9th, Ukraine was not simply hitting a new target. It was completing a sequence. Syzran gone since May 21st. Novokuibishevsk hobbled since April 18th. Kuibyshev confirmed offline June 12th. The Samara hub as a functional unit ceased to exist this week, and that had never happened before in this war. Now let me give you the wider picture, because what is happening in Samara is not a standalone event, it is the sharpest spike in a curve that has been climbing all year. Bloomberg counted 38 attacks on Russian refineries between January and May 2026, with 16 in May alone, the highest single-month total since the full-scale invasion began. In the first 5 months of this year, Ukraine struck Russian refineries 32 times, nearly matching the entire total of 34 strikes for all of 2024. Ukraine has now hit at least 24 of Russia's 33 refineries capable of processing more than 1 million tons per year. That is not a campaign of harassment. That is a campaign of attrition. Methodical, patient, and escalating. The effects on output are now showing up even in Russia's own official data, which makes them remarkable because the Kremlin stopped publishing specific fuel output figures some time ago. But Russia's Rosneft statistical index, which it still publishes, shows output of coke and oil products down 9.2% year-on-year in April and down 11.3% from March. OilX, the energy analytics firm, estimates Russian refinery throughput in May 2026 averaged 4.58 million barrels per day. That is approximately 700,000 barrels per day lower than a year earlier. It is the lowest level since October 2009. Refinery utilization has fallen 14% since the beginning of 2026 and now sits about 20% below pre-war levels. The International Energy Agency cut its 2026 forecast for Russian refining throughput by 150,000 barrels per day in May, specifically citing the increasing effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes. These are not Ukrainian government figures. These are the IEA and a private analytics firm and Russia's own statistical agency, all telling the same story. I want to be honest about what I don't know here, because this is precisely where the headlines can get ahead of the facts. When you see figures like 1/4 of Russia's refining capacity offline, there is an important caveat that Sergei Vakulenko of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has raised, and it is worth your attention. Those headline capacity figures often represent the cumulative total of all refineries struck since a given date, not the number simultaneously out of operation at any one moment. Some plants resume partial operations within days of a strike. A damaged unit is not always a dead unit. The real simultaneous offline figure is almost certainly lower than the largest numbers being circulated. I am telling you this because anyone selling you certainty about the precise current state of Russian fuel production is overstating what can be verified from open sources. What we can say with confidence is that the directional trend across multiple independent data sources is unambiguous and worsening. The floor keeps dropping. What we also know is that Russia's own behavior is the most honest signal we have. And Russia's behavior this spring has told a very clear story. On April 1st, Russia banned gasoline exports. On June 1st, for the first time in its history, Russia banned aviation kerosene exports, effective through November 30th. Think about what that means. Russia is the world's second largest oil producer. It exports energy as its primary source of hard currency. And it is now banning exports of its own fuel to protect domestic supply. That is not the behavior of a country managing a minor disruption. That is the behavior of a country choosing between its own market and its foreign revenue, and choosing the market, because without it the political consequences become unmanageable. Diesel production fell roughly 10% in May, on top of a 10% fall in April. 2 consecutive months of double-digit decline. And Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, speaking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum earlier this month, said, and I want to be precise here, that Russia's oil production is indeed lower compared to the beginning of 2026 inches, and that the country has a number of refineries under unscheduled repairs. For a Russian official to say that at a flagship economic showcase event in public is not nothing. That is the Kremlin's own deputy prime minister confirming the core of what the data already showed. So where does that stress go? It travels downstream. And the place it is most visible right now is at the pump, in Russian cities far from any front line. On June 4th, 15 Russian regions reported fuel shortages. By June 10th, in under 1 week, that number had risen to 25 regions, plus 6 occupied Ukrainian territories. The shortage spread to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to Belgorod, Kursk, Leningrad, and Moscow regions. The Krasnodar governor went on television on June 8th and said that people had decided to stock up on gasoline, creating what he called artificial panic buying. And on that exact same day, the Energy Ministry issued a formal statement creating a crisis task force and cited, in writing, growing enemy air attacks as the root cause. One hand of the Russian government blaming the public for panicking, the other hand acknowledging to itself that the drones are winning. Both statements were issued on June 8th. You do not need to take anyone's word for what is actually happening. The Russian government told you itself, in 2 different documents, on the same day. In Sevastopol, the Russian-occupied Crimean port city, the fuel rationing system has become a case study in how a modern authoritarian state manages scarcity. Residents must now use a dedicated bot on Russia's state-backed Max messaging app to generate a 1-time per week QR code. The code allows them to purchase up to 20 liters of gasoline, 20 liters, once per week. The first batch of those codes sold out within 2 hours of release. And on June 10th, the Russian-installed governor of Sevastopol went on camera and said, and I am paraphrasing but only just, I am addressing everyone, there is no point in lining up at the gas stations tomorrow. In Crimea, black market resellers are now offering fuel at 130 to 150 rubles per liter, roughly 50% above official prices. The official price itself has already risen. AI 92 gasoline in Crimea is running about 82 rubles per liter versus 69 in Moscow. The further you get from the center of the supply chain, the more the price tells the truth. And now I want to take a step back from the immediate crisis and talk about the strategic layer beneath it, because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely complex. Ukraine's targeting doctrine has evolved. In the early phase of the refinery campaign, Ukraine was hitting primary crude distillation units, the first stage of refining, where raw crude is separated into its component fractions. Those units are large and relatively straightforward in design. They can be repaired in weeks to months if parts are available. Russia absorbed those strikes, made repairs, and restored some capacity. Ukraine's planners noticed, and they changed the target set. The campaign shifted towards secondary processing units, the crackers, reformers, and hydrodesulfurization units that convert the output of primary distillation into usable, high-quality gasoline and diesel. These units are far more complex. They require precision components. They require parts that, under Western sanctions, Russia can no longer source from the countries that originally built them. Sourcing from China or domestic manufacture takes months, sometimes longer. And Ukraine did not just shift targets once. It began striking the same facilities repeatedly, specifically to collapse the repair window before a plant could return to service. The Yanos refinery was struck 3 times in May alone. Lukoil facilities in Nizhny Novgorod and Perm were each hit twice. The Kuibyshev refinery has now been struck in March 2024, August 2025, January 2026, and June 2026, each time with escalating damage. Ukraine is not trying to damage Russian refineries. Ukraine is trying to make them unrecoverable faster than Russia can fix them. Sergei Vakulenko of Carnegie described the logic precisely. Secondary units are what allow refineries to produce more gasoline and diesel from a given barrel of crude. They are also much harder and more costly to repair because Western sanctions have made it genuinely difficult to source replacement equipment. That is the vice. Ukraine is hitting the hardest to replace components. Russia cannot get the parts quickly. Ukraine hits again before the parts arrive. The plant stays down. Over time, the cumulative effect compounds. Now let me bring in the June 12th strikes because they represent something new in terms of geographic reach. And I want to be careful about what I say here because some of the damage is not yet fully confirmed. On the night of June 12th, Russia Day, the national holiday, Ukraine launched what appears to have been its largest long-range drone campaign against energy infrastructure to date. The targets included the TANECO refinery and the Taif-NK refinery in Nizhnekamsk, Tatarstan. TANECO is a Tatneft facility with a design capacity of over 16 million tons of crude per year. It produces diesel, aviation fuel, and lubricants, all of direct military relevance. Taif-NK has an oil processing conversion rate of over 95%, meaning it extracts nearly maximum value from every barrel it runs. Also struck was the Togliattikauchuk chemical plant in Togliatti, in the Samara region. The Kyiv Post reports that this plant is one of Russia's primary producers of synthetic rubber and that its products include materials reportedly used in the production of solid rocket fuel for Russian missiles. I want to flag that last point explicitly. The rocket fuel connection is sourced to Kyiv Post analysis and is plausible given the plant's known product list, but it has not been independently verified by a third-party energy analyst as of the time I am recording this. I will not present it as established fact. What is established is that it is a major Russian petrochemical facility that is now burning. The geographic reach of these strikes is significant. Nizhnekamsk, Tatarstan, is 1,130 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Togliatti is 890 kilometers away. Russia claimed to have intercepted 231 drones during this attack, a figure that, if accurate, suggests the scale of what Ukraine launched. Airspace restrictions forced the cancellation of state holiday celebrations across central Russia on what was supposed to be one of the Kremlin's signature national occasions. That is not a minor detail. It is a signal of how deep inside Russian political and civilian life this campaign has now penetrated. Ukraine's general staff also confirmed that the TANECO strike involved coordination with a group it identified as a rebel movement called Black Spark, which it said operates inside Tatarstan. I want to be very direct with you. The identity, size, and actual operational role of Black Spark inside Tatarstan is unverified by any independent source as of June 13th. It could be a genuine resistance network. It could be a Ukrainian Special Operations Forces designation. It could be something in between. What the General Staff confirmed is that the key ELU EVT-7 primary processing unit at TANECO was substantially damaged. The processing suspension itself has not yet been confirmed by independent industry sources. I am telling you what is confirmed and what is not, because that distinction matters. There is also a weapons development dimension to this week that deserves its own moment, because it changes the strategic calculus going forward. On June 10th, Ukrainian Flamingo cruise missiles struck the VNI Progress Defense Electronics plant in Cheboksary, in Chuvashia, over 900 kilometers from the front line. The FP-5 Flamingo is Ukraine's own domestically produced cruise missile. Its reported range is up to 3,000 kilometers. Its warhead is around 1,150 kilograms. The ISS describes it as one of the largest and longest-range ground-launched cruise missile systems in existence. The Cheboksary plant, it struck, sanctioned by Ukraine, the United States, and the European Union, produces satellite navigation receivers and antennas used in Shahed-type drones, Kalibr cruise missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles, and guided aerial bombs. Ukraine used a domestically built cruise missile to strike a plant that makes guidance systems for the weapons Russia uses to strike Ukraine. That is a sentence worth reading twice. And it tells you that the range problem, the geographic buffer Russia thought it had, is now being solved in Ukrainian factories. Now, I want to come back to something I said I would not skip over because intellectual honesty requires it. Russia is not helpless in the face of this campaign. Moscow still has significant refining capacity east of the Urals, the Omsk and Angarsk plants in particular, that remains beyond the current operational range of most Ukrainian drone systems. For military fuel logistics routed through Siberia, those facilities provide a real buffer. The Kremlin has also shown it can manage shortage through rationing and export bans, blunt instruments, but functional ones in the short term. Kazakhstan was approached about providing emergency gasoline supply. Russia's Ministry of Energy has signed mandatory production volume agreements with 11 major oil corporations: Rosneft, Gazprom Neft, Lukoil, Surgutneftgaz, and others, placing fuel production under direct government control. These are not the actions of a government that has already lost. They are the actions of a government that is fighting to hold a system together that is under genuine and escalating stress. The honest version of this story is that both things can be true at once. Russia's refining infrastructure is being degraded faster than at any previous point in this war. And Russia retains enough capacity, institutional resilience, and political control that the frontline fuel impact, while likely and probably imminent, has not been openly confirmed in open source reporting as of this recording. The 2 to 4 week lag between refinery shutdown and fuel depletion at forward logistics depots is a standard military logistics estimate. It is not confirmed intelligence about what is happening right now in Russian fuel depots in eastern Ukraine. The Samara hub went fully offline around June 10th. The May production collapse was the worst in 16 years. If the logistics model holds, the pressure on Russian armored and aviation assets should intensify through late June and into July. But I will not tell you it is already happening, because I cannot verify that it is. What I can tell you is that the trajectory is clear, the mechanisms are real, and the Kremlin's own behavior, the export bans, the rationing, the task forces, the Novak admission at St. Petersburg, confirms that something serious is occurring behind the official reassurances. Now let me bring this to you directly, because this war has a way of feeling distant until it touches the things you actually pay for. Russia supplies roughly 10 to 12% of the world's crude oil. Its refining output feeds not only its own domestic market, but also the broader global balance of petroleum products that affects prices everywhere, including at the pump where you fill your car. When Russian diesel production falls 10% in April and another 10% in May, that tightening does not stay inside Russian borders. Global diesel markets absorb it. Energy traders price it in. The International Energy Agency noticed it enough to cut its official forecast for Russian output by 150,000 barrels per day in May. That number moves prices. And if the campaign continues to accelerate, if the Flamingo missiles can now reach facilities that drones previously could not, if the Samara hub remains offline through the summer, if the June 12th Tatarstan strikes prove to have done the damage Ukraine claims, then you are looking at a sustained reduction in Russian refining output that will ripple through global energy markets in ways that are still being priced. The war underneath the war has a way of ending up in the numbers on the sign outside your gas station. That is not alarmism. That is how commodity markets work. So what does the evidence actually show and what does it not show? Let me be clear about both. The evidence shows that Russia's refinery throughput is at its lowest level since 2009, confirmed by independent analysts. It shows that the Samara hub, Rosneft's integrated regional cluster, has all three of its plants simultaneously offline for the first time in this war. It shows that Russia has banned both gasoline and aviation fuel exports in that sequence, as supply stress reached levels that overrode commercial logic. It shows that 25 Russian regions are experiencing civilian fuel shortages, up from 15 in under a week. It shows that Ukraine has struck at least 24 of Russia's 33 major refineries and is now doing so with a domestically built cruise missile capable of reaching targets over 100 kilometers inside Russian territory. It shows that Russia's own deputy prime minister acknowledged falling oil production and unscheduled refinery repairs at a public economic forum. What the evidence does not show, not yet, not in open sources, is confirmed fuel shortages at Russian frontline military units. It does not show a confirmed processing halt at TANECO. It does not independently verify the role of the entity called Black Spark. It does not tell us how long the Kubyshev repairs will take, or whether Ukraine will strike again before those repairs can begin. The gap between Russian refining is under severe stress, and Russian military operations are being meaningfully constrained by fuel, is real. It may be closing, but I will not tell you it is closed because I do not know that, and neither does anyone else reporting from open sources today. What I do know is this. The governors who blamed panic buying while their own ministry formed a fuel crisis task force told you something important. Not about the public's behavior. About their own. Governments that are managing a crisis confidently do not contradict themselves in writing on the same day. The contradiction is the signal, and in authoritarian systems where the truth tends to leak from the gap between what officials say and what officials do, that gap has been widening all spring. Which leaves me with a question that I think is worth sitting with longer than most of the headlines will. Ukraine is not just striking Russian refineries. It is changing the geographic and industrial definition of what is reachable. A target 1,130 kilometers inside Russia was struck this week. A domestically produced cruise missile did the striking, and the facility it hit makes guidance systems for the missiles Russia fires at Ukrainian cities. At what point does the concept of a strategic rear, a safe distance from conflict, stop being a geographic fact and become a political assumption? And if that assumption is wrong for Russia today, who does it become wrong for next? This is Prof. Yang. I'll see you in the next one.